I'm Ellen Dornan. I'm the National History Day Coordinator for the state of New Mexico, and this is brought to you by the New Mexico Humanities Council. And we're talking about breaking barriers in history. So because 2020 is the centennial of the passage of women's suffrage, we would like to talk a little bit about women's suffrage in New Mexico. And I'm fortunate enough today to be joined by Dr. Meredith Machan, who is the past president of the League of Women Voters of New Mexico and the chair of the History Committee. She also directs the Education and Immigration Committees. She was the former vice president of Santa Fe Community College and taught at the college level for 36 years. Georgellen Burnett is a native New Mexican and women's historian. Her work includes the book, We Just Toughed It Out, Women in the Llano Estacado. Georgellen devotes her time to women's history, women's political advocacy, and domestic violence issues. She was nominated to the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1998. And if you all have any questions, you can use the YouTube chat feature, or you can email me at historyday@nmhumanities.org. So welcome, Georgellen and Meredith. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you, Ellen.
Thank you so much for doing this, Ellen.
Well, we have a lot to talk about today. So can we start out with sort of an overview of how the suffrage amendment got ratified in New Mexico? Who were the people working for suffrage?
Okay, this is Meredith's field of expertise.
Okay, yeah, if we're going to go up to the New Mexico story, I think we're, missing a lot of the background that I thought Georgellen was going to go into with the Declaration of Sentiments and the First Women's Rights Convention.
Well, we can start there.
What?
We can start there if you want.
Yeah, I think it's important to get a little background, historical background, because...
Absolutely, the context is king.
Yes.
Exactly. Yes. So we want to go back. This is the book that I used in graduate school, Century of Struggle by Eleanor Flaxner, The Women's Rights Movement in the United States. This is an excellent book. Still, as you can see, pages are falling out of my copy. But to start with the women's rights movement in America, we need to go back to 1840. And we need to recognize that feminism is always a piggyback movement. It comes on the back of some other movement. And in the 1840s, it was piggybacked on abolitionism because the women who started the women's rights movement were abolitionists. And of course, the one that we know of, the most famous, of course, is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She is the intellectual, philosophical center of the first wave of feminism. And what started the movement was that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was newly married, and for her honeymoon, her husband took her to an anti-slavery convention in London. And there were many women there, and there was a huge debate among the men, and it was decided the women would not be seated, and they would have to sit in a balcony behind a screen and could not speak. So, and this was a very bad choice on their part, because Elizabeth Cady Stanton was sitting with Lucretia Mott, who was a great Quaker preacher and abolitionist and feminist, and they talked about how sometimes the things that happen to slaves are similar to things that happen to women, such as they have no right to their wages. If they were divorced, they had no right to their children. Their property, if their husband died, was very limited that they could inherit. And so they began to see themselves as people who did not have the rights that men had. In much the same way, of course, to a greater degree, the slaves had, of course, less rights. But they looked at this and they said, you know, and so that began. And then they met, they talked, they corresponded. Lucretia Mott came to visit Elizabeth Cady Stanton in Seneca Falls. And they just said one day, they said, well, let's have a women's rights convention. And that's what they did. And they put a very tiny ad in the paper, and they secured a small church to meet in. And the day came for the rights convention. They went to the church, and it was locked because people said, oh, no, we cannot have this. And somebody crawled through a window, opened it up, and then they had the women's rights convention. And this went on for 2 days, I believe, in 1848 in Seneca Falls. And it was in the summer, so it was really hot. And I've been to Seneca Falls, but I was there in the fall when it was really cold. And they decided to write up the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that she would write this. She based it on the Declaration of Independence. And there were several articles, things that they wanted. And the last thing that they asked for was the right to vote. And this was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's idea. And everybody was very scandalized. Lucretia Mott said, you're asking for too much. Frederick Douglass, who was there, the great abolitionist and escaped slave, really was the only person who supported her in asking for the right to vote. And I want you to understand, this is the first time anybody ever said women should have the right to vote. And all of the articles were passed unanimously, except for the one about the right to vote, but it did pass. And of course, that became the lightning rod for the early feminist movement.
Just out of curiosity, what was the opposition to, I mean, who was voting against women having the right to vote if everything else was unanimous?
Because they were asking too much. And they said, you know, the cult of womanhood, which was what women, that was their social construct of their lives, said that they were homemakers and that they raised children who would become great patriots in America, and then they would vote. And so they felt that it was not within their sphere, that this was something that was very controversial, which it was. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton recognized that if you do not have the right to vote, you have no power. And that's why people like Meredith are out there every day going, hey, you need to vote. So that's what happened. So it was very controversial. So I want you to understand, this is not like oh yeah, we should do that. This is you have asked too much and you will make fools of us, I think is what Lucretia Mott said.
So I'll take over a little bit from there and say that New Mexico was late coming into the suffrage movement, because think of New Mexico as being a territory. Until 1848, it was actually part of Mexico, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave it to the Americans after, in a settlement after the 1846 war. And so, while Elizabeth Cady Stanton was having the Declaration of Women's Rights and the convention and so on, New Mexico was just barely becoming American. And so the New Mexico territory actually extended all the way to California. The whole half of Arizona was also part of the New Mexico territory. And as you know, New Mexico did not become a state until 1912. But in the Constitution of 1910, which was necessary to, have in preparation to apply for statehood, men gave women the limited suffrage, they could vote in school elections, but even that, there was a caveat that if people objected, meaning men objected, then they could deny the right to vote even in school elections. And this meant school board elections. And that was the only sphere in which women were allowed to have influence because that was relatively safe. You just think it had nothing to do with taxes. Women's purview was to take care of children and make sure that they were raised properly and it fit well within their traditional mode. When we had a territorial secretary named George Wallace, who was married to Catrin Wallace, and Catrin Wallace had worked in Australia in 1890. New Zealand was the first country to give women the right to vote. And she had watched what had happened in New Zealand, and she went to Australia and worked. And she got thousands and thousands of pamphlets and speeches and testimonials and knocking on doors and so on happening in Australia. And she brought back some of those strategies. And then Carrie Chapman Catt, who is one of the leaders of the suffrage movement, who took over from Susan B. Anthony as the head of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. She came to New Mexico in 1899 and stayed at the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe on the plaza. And they basically strategized, Catrin Wallace and Carrie Chapman Catt. I think they had about 40 people come to the Palace of the Governors for a meeting. And Carrie Chapman Catt was visiting 11 states at that point, trying to work on suffrage through the states, because the idea there at first was to get each state to ratify to pass their own suffrage laws so that they could have vote in full elections. But Carrie Chapman Catt was very discouraged when she came to New Mexico. And remember, it's still a territory. Most people were illiterate and spoke Spanish rather than English. That did not come through until statehood, that people were supposed to, although we're now a bilingual state, people were expected to speak English in order to be part of the United States. So anyway, at that point, she was very despairing, and she went on to all of these other states and started working much more earnestly there, and didn't come back to New Mexico until December of 1919, when she had convinced Governor Larzolo to call a special session to ratify the 19th Amendment, which had at that point been passed by Congress. Congress passed it June 4th, 1919, and then it was sent out to the states for ratification. And New Mexico was the 32nd of 36 states to ratify the amendment. And finally, New Mexico women were allowed to vote in the 1920 presidential election because it had been ratified across the land by enough states. So I know that there's some other questions you wanted to get to, and I kind of gave a fast forward.
No, I think that's a great overview. So what happened in that intervening 20 years, though, if the suffrage organizers first came in 1899, and then all of a sudden in 1919, it got ratified in 1919 or 1920?
Well, it got ratified in 1920, but Congress had passed it in 1919. But there was actually more going on. In 1893, there was a huge exposition in Chicago. And suffragists were very, very active. And by 1893, there definitely was a suffrage association in Albuquerque, And, women had been working on suffrage, but, I didn't mean to say that nothing was going on. There was quite a bit going on. And New Mexico actually plays a huge role in the getting the amendment through Congress. First, when we became a state in 1912, our first senator, we have two senators from New Mexico. As every state, of course, has two senators. And Mrs. Albert Fall was married to one of the senators, Albert Fall, who ended up a career in disgrace, but she was a suffragist, and he was for suffrage. On the other hand, our other senator, Thomas Catrin, was vehemently opposed to women's suffrage. He said the Bible declared that, basically the Adam and Eve story showed that women came out of Adam's rib, and that they were supposed to be inferior to men and helpmate to men. And certainly they were not supposed to leave their domestic sphere. They were supposed to stay at home, clean the house, take care of children, and so on. And there's some wonderful articles that are listed in the resources on the New Mexico Humanities Council under the Women 2020. It's under initiatives and then Women 2020. And Ellen has been very kind about posting these articles from the New Mexican from 1915 and 1916, which are really hard to read, very hard transcripts to read, but they are priceless.
Whoops.
Okay, and you need to read them.
And my advice is, if you go to retrieve those resources, just blow the PDFs up as big as you can, because
right,
they're big full-size newspaper articles, but very worth it. And that link is up next to the YouTube viewer, the video viewer.
And this book, New Mexico Women, this is a series of articles edited by Joan M. Jensen and Darlis Miller, who are very important New Mexico historians. This, I believe, is really like the first book about women's history in New Mexico, and it came out in the late 80s, I believe. And inside there is an article, Disenfranchisement is a Disgrace, that talks very extensively about the suffrage movement in New Mexico and what they had to do after suffrage was passed, because unfortunately, just because you get the right to vote doesn't mean you get all your rights. And so there's also an article following that's about the campaign for women's community property rights in New Mexico. You can't see this, I don't know why I'm holding it up. Which is interesting because in New Mexico, our law is derived from Spanish law, and Spanish law gave rights to women. It is English common law that came in the 13 colonies, was established in the 13 colonies. That is the law that does not give rights to women. And I was talking to Meredith about this yesterday. So just want you to know that the rule of thumb is a factor of English common law. It means that you can beat your wife, but the stick cannot be any bigger than your thumb. So these are the kind of things that we're dealing with, that women were considered not intelligent human beings in and of themselves. So that's the barrier that we're trying to break. We're still trying to break it. And that's what we want to encourage your students to talk about, breaking barriers, and breaking barriers for women in all types, not just politics and voting, but reproductive rights. And Meredith knows this, and I've sent this to you, Ellen, that Catrin McCormick is my new hero. So read about Catrin McCormick on Ellen's website. You'll be very excited about her. I was.
And she lived in New Mexico, right?
She does have a link to New Mexico, so we can claim her as a native daughter, which makes me very proud.
Okay.
So who are, I mean, speaking of some of these New Mexican women, what did, how are the women organizing within New Mexico? And I mean, I guess I have a bunch of questions. Was it sort of equal, Hispanic and Anglo, or?
I think there were a lot of Hispanic women whose stories have not been told, but frankly, there were a lot of Anglo women who had come in with the railroad, 1881, and settled, and they'd brought ideas from other parts in the country. You think about Wyoming was the first state to give women the vote, and when it was a territory in 1869, and when it applied for statehood, actually the federal government said, well, not as long as you give women the right to vote. And they were so adamant that women were going to retain the right to vote that they said, forget it. We don't care about becoming a state if you're going to take away equal rights for women. But then the federal government gave in and did allow Wyoming to come in with suffrage for women. But other states, people came in on the railroad from, Chicago and from New York and from a lot of other places, and they brought ideas to New Mexico, which helped to enlighten them that, the ways in New Mexico were not the only ways. And remember, women started being able to go to college even around this time. That was a very radical idea. There was a time in American history where women were not allowed to go to school. They were not even allowed to read. And so, reading is a radical act.
As we're not allowed to speak in public. This was a big issue with the abolitionists and the first women's rights movement, that women were not allowed to speak in public. This was scandalous. Yes. And so if you can't speak in public, you can't even tell other people your ideas.
But I think we need to give women of the colonial era a lot of credit too. And one of the famous expressions that a lot of people refer to is Abigail Adams, who was the wife of the second president, John Adams, said when he was going off to work on the Declaration of Independence, which was very, very radical and secretive, of course, to get people together to decide that they would object to tyranny. And Abigail Adams said, part of what people always quote is, remember the ladies. And she basically said, you can be prepared for a rebellion by women if women are not allowed to, she wasn't talking about voting, but to have, if they didn't have equal rights. Because, as you know, the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. At that point, they were basically talking about 15% of the men, and the ones who owned property and who were white. And they really did not include women, but women were working from colonial times and in New Mexico, in Native communities, Hispanic communities. They were all working together to improve communities. I think we have to take off our hats to the Native Americans in upper state New York and so on, because they're the ones who actually showed, they were matriarchal too, by the way, but they showed the Americans a new way of dealing with disagreements and with power, so that people could discuss things. We have to have disagreements, in order to come up with the best solutions, because people are always going to see things in different ways. But the Iroquois Confederacy taught Americans a lot, and women learned, wow, let's see how we can improve our communities through shared decision making. So anyway, women were always working on improving conditions for their families, working on libraries and getting books for students and improving health and so on. So it didn't just start with the suffrage movement.
No, it did not. But this is all very much part of women's sphere. That was what, they were considered, this is something that women will do. And so it was something that they could use to expand their power. But remember that they also have to, many of the women, of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had 7 children. And Susan B. Anthony was often very angry with her because that meant she couldn't go out on the road. And she's like, oh, she's having another baby. So it's very important to take into account the reproductive system of women and what that does. And this, I'll get on my soapbox. No woman can call herself free who does not own and control her own body. And I do a lot of work with domestic violence. And this is the center of my theory, is that we have to have control of our own bodies before, we can affect our world. Also, something that's very interesting that happened after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when New Mexico became part of the United States, Presbyterian churches on the East Coast sent young women missionaries to New Mexico to convert New Mexicans to Christianity. The fact that they were Catholics, they seem to have kind of forgotten that. It's a very interesting thing. It's in a book called No Separate Refuge that I used when I was teaching women's studies. And what happened, of course, is that some of those women got here, young Presbyterian women, and they went, I'm going home. But a lot of them stayed, and they were in small Hispanic communities. And as you know, the social history of the Hispanic village, it is pretty much matriarchal. And those women were very much, most of them were co-opted, and they ended up marrying Hispanic men, or they just lived their lives as an independent woman in the Hispanic village. It didn't turn out the way the Presbyterians thought it would. So that's just really interesting.
I think the Catholic Church was opposed to the women's vote. And I think the leaders of the suffrage movement were Quakers, Presbyterians, I suppose you'd put them, or Protestants, I should say. They believed in equal rights. And, when you look back at who the suffrage leaders are, and, I think on the website you have a link to the National Park Service where they have top suffragists you should know, and all these little biographies are there, including one of the leaders I want to talk about, Nina Otero Warren, who is Hispanic. Basically, when you look back at what had to be overcome in New Mexico, the Catholic Church was frankly very patriarchal. And as you know, women still can't become priests. And the Catholic Church is still opposing a lot of birth control measures and so on. So, the Protestant women were very important in influencing the vote. Nina Otero Warren, whom I just mentioned, who grew up in her first, I think, 8 years were in Los Lunas, New Mexico. She moved to Santa Fe when her cousin became the territorial governor of New Mexico, and so anyway, she was brought up a Catholic, but because the Catholic Church did not allow divorce, it was scandalous to be divorced. When she married a guy named Lieutenant Rawson Warren, and found out that he had a common law wife and 2 children, and she left him after 2 years, and she actually got divorced, which is very scandalous, but she pretended that she was a widow because it just was not socially acceptable to be a divorcee. And so she kind of bucked the Catholic Church in some ways. She became a very important suffrage leader in New Mexico. And on the National Park Service site that I just mentioned, if you look at I think it's nps.gov, 19th Amendment, New Mexico, you can see a little profile of Nina Otero Warren and her home, which is now part of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. It's the research center of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. But she came to Santa Fe and started, she was very influenced by, of course, her powerful family members, and then also by what was going on in Santa Fe, which had become actually at that point, it was larger than Albuquerque, and this was 1887, and it was obviously it's the capital of the state. It was the tourist mecca, and people came from all over the world to come to New Mexico for the cure for tuberculosis. And so there was a lot of influence, artists and writers and thinkers from around the world who came into Santa Fe. And she was part of a very enriched circle that involved both Anglo and Hispanic women and people from other countries, and she started getting an education about women's rights, and I can talk more about her later if we have time.
Nina's very important, and I think it's fabulous that Meredith has started this program to honor her, to get a marker for her. But the other things, the bad side of Nina's story is that when New Mexico became a state, she ran for the one seat in the House of Representatives, and it was her cousin, Miguel Otero, who outed her as a divorced woman. And she lost the election because of that. And then later, I am not an expert on queer history or anything like that, but later in her life, she had a very long relationship with a woman, and they had a ranch and they had a real estate business, and it was called Los Dos. So we do have a historian who is going to look into that part of her life to see if perhaps she's not only just one of our great Hispanic women leaders and one of our great suffrage leaders, but she might have been, involved in a same-sex relationship. And so I think it's fascinating that we can find these things out about women. And I would also like to suggest to everybody out there who wants resources to go to the National Women's History Alliance online. And I think all of you should buy a Votes for Women sash, because Meredith and I are going to be working on something to happen for the 100th anniversary here in Santa Fe. So we need you all to buy sashes so you can come and wear them.
Right. Can we switch over to how we're going to celebrate the centennial, or do you want to stay on the history at this point?
Let's stay on the history. I don't know anything about how we're going to celebrate, yes, except that we are.
Okay. I would like to mention, Ellen, I can't hear you.
I just want to talk real quickly about what happened with the opposition and how the suffragists in New Mexico overcame it, because you mentioned that Senator Fall was in favor of suffrage.
No.
Senator Catrin was against it.
Right. Okay.
And was a big oppositional force.
Okay, so as I started to say and then forgot, when Senator Catrin, Thomas Catrin, went to Washington as one of New Mexico's two senators after we became a state, he was given the job to chair the Senate Committee on Woman Suffrage. And just think of this. Here he opposes suffrage, as I mentioned before, and so the Susan B. Anthony Amendment had been sitting in Congress from 1878 when a California Senator, Aaron Sargent, had introduced it into Congress, and basically when Senator Thomas Catrin had the job of chairing this committee, he refused to bring the amendment, which had passed in the House of Representatives back then, to the floor of the Senate. And so anyway, women, there were 150 suffragists who came one day in October 20th, 19th, 20th, 21st, all the articles are on the website there. 1915, they went to, they had parades on the plaza, and the Catrin building is right on the corner of the plaza, by the way, in Santa Fe, right opposite the Palace of the Governors. And they pleaded with him, and they also marched to his house, and 150 suffragists, and a lot of them took automobiles, which were in vogue, and they went there, and a whole delegation spoke to him about why he would not bring the suffrage amendment onto the Senate floor. They pleaded with them, please get this passed, and he was polite but very condescending, and he said basically women belong in the home, and as I said, the Bible's declared that women were men's helpmate, and so no, he would not change his mind. But women kept on protesting, and they finally realized the only way to do this was to get a new senator. And so Senator Andreas A. Jones from Las Vegas, New Mexico, got elected in 1916, and he took Thomas Catrin's place, not only in the Senate, but as chair of the Senate Committee on Woman Suffrage. And he worked with Carrie Chapman Catt and suffragists from the American Woman Suffrage Association and others. He worked behind the scenes to get the House to pass the amendment again, because remember they passed it in 1878, but to pass it again and then to get it onto the Senate floor in 1919, and he did so in February, and it actually narrowly was defeated because the presidential election of 1916 was coming up, and essentially they wanted, each party wanted to take credit for passing what was now pretty inevitable, the Women's Suffrage Amendment. And so it was, but he was a Democrat from Las Vegas, and basically Woodrow Wilson had agreed to Carrie Chapman Catt, the head of the National American Women Association, later to be called the League of Women Voters, which I'm a member of. And we're celebrating our 100th anniversary along with the 19th Amendment ratification. But anyway, Andreas Jones is really very important because he worked behind the scenes, and he built the momentum that finally got the suffrage amendment ready to be passed. And then it was passed actually by the 66th Congress, 41 years later. and sent out to the states for ratification. And as I mentioned, Carrie Chapman Catt came back to New Mexico to get women the suffrage amendment passed. Sorry about that.
And it was Governor Larazzolo who ended up.
Yeah, Taviano Larazzolo. Yes, and he was very important. Getting back to Nina, I want to tell you one little story that's very important. She was the first woman in New Mexico history who was ever allowed to go into a Republican caucus. And she, at 10:30, the Republicans on, I think it was February 18th or 19th, I'm not exactly sure, had a caucus, and she pretty much told them that they could not leave the room until they agreed to support the women's suffrage amendment. And she's described in one of the articles that I believe you have posted on your website as being so important in getting that amendment passed. I don't know if you want to go back to some other Hispanic women suffragists, if we have time, or what you'd like to go on to.
You know what? We are running a little bit short on time.
Ellen, can I say one thing?
Oh, please.
Okay. Meredith has brought this up about Senator Catrin and saying that women in the Bible, and we talked about the Catholic Church. I want people to know Elizabeth Cady Stanton rewrote the Bible so that she made it. She took out everything that she thought was derogatory to our women. This is what she spent the last 10 years of her life doing. So,
I bet a lot of people didn't know that.
I bet they don't. So, I mean, that's somebody who's really brilliant, really philosophical, and a really hard worker. So I just want you to know that about her. This was an amazing woman.
Right.
And I did want to say, by the way, we for any teachers who are teaching women's history, we have this free source book of women in American history that NHP put together. So you can just contact me. I'm happy to get it to you. Where are other good places to research? Georgellen, you've suggested a couple of really good books.
Okay. I spent a lot of time on Amazon looking for women's history books and women's rights books. There's a wealth of information. I just was looking before we got on this. There's a new book that's called The Myth of Seneca Falls about, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony kind of created this. So there's all kinds of new scholarship out there that's interesting, that gives you new ideas. But I want young people to know that their mothers are the women who have changed the world, and they made it better for them. That's our job. We have to make the world better for those young women and men who are going to come after us. And your mothers are very important. And I know I would not have my degrees. I would not be who I am without my mother. She was I didn't know it was a choice not to go to college.
Under the links that Ellen has put on the National Humanities Council website, there are some wonderful resources. There's actually the Women's Centennial, but you can just Google things like the Library of Congress is fabulous. They have wonderful resources on the suffrage movement, and then there is a Gazette that I think you also posted, the women's. Women win the vote. Unfortunately, New Mexico did not get in there, except for Nina Otero Warren, a picture, I think it was on page 19 of that Gazette. But you can download that Gazette, and you can also go onto the website, the National Women's History Alliance, and request a free copy of it. and buy your sashes and be ready for, we're going to have a celebration at the New Mexico Capitol on February 6th. There'll be tables and displays, and everybody's encouraged to wear suffrage gear, which is basically white, purple, and yellow. Or it's kind of like it's color of the sunflower, and you should definitely wear costumes and see if you can investigate suffragists who are in your community, your grandmothers too. Where great grandmothers were probably very influenced by the vote. It'd be very interesting for students not just to look at the primary sources that are on Library of Congress and the National Park Service links and so on, but actually go and try to research. You can do that through, you can find, of course, oral histories in your community. Do that. Find older women, and ask them if they had heard any stories about voting for the first time. Did their grandmothers or great grandmothers vote, and what was it like? Some people didn't, but think about this: 27 million women were enfranchised. Half of the population were enfranchised when the amendment passed in 1920. And before that time, certain states, I think it was 16 states, had allowed women to vote in all elections, and 15 million of the 27 million were allowed to vote. But women have changed the politics and they've changed the communities. And right now, we have good representation in Congress, but we only have 25%. Women are half the population. We only have 25%. So, we need more women to step up and get elected and go into leadership roles, because women see the world in the long view, I think, more than men. And they think about, let's just make sure that we're protecting our environment, our food, our water, our schools, our social services, and so on, for the long term, for our grandchildren and great grandchildren.
Definitely. And I'm just going to give one shout out that there's going to be one student out there who's interested in Billy the Kid. So this book is about Susan McSween. And I lived in Roswell for a long time, spent a long time in Lincoln, and I was always going around going, where's the book about Susan McSween? Here it is. So this is the woman's point of view of the Lincoln County War.
Excellent. That hasn't been done yet, has it?
No. And this book, the woman who wrote this book, worked with Nora Henn, who's a famous historian in Lincoln, who's now dead, and her papers are now kind of scattered. So there may never be another opportunity to do the research that was done in this book. So yeah. Really, I was so pleased to find this book. Finally, somebody wrote about Susan McSween.
I'd like to mention there's a biography that I did not write that's on the list, the New Mexico Humanities Council has so kindly created it, on Ada McPherson Morley. And she was very important. Before, she lived in Datil, or Datil, as some people say, New Mexico, which is, down south. And it was a mining town, but she wrote scores of letters to Congress and to the president, and pleading for the women's vote. And this is in the 1890s. And so we had leaders in New Mexico who were very, very diligent. And if you look in Library of Congress, you can see Some of these things are online and some of them aren't. In the records from the National Women's Party, which was run by, or the Congressional Union, which was run by Alice Paul, who's a very important hero in New Mexico history and American history. You can see papers there that include letters from Ada McPherson Morley and you know, other women from New Mexico, including Nina Otero Warren, and also letters in the National American Woman Suffrage Association letters that are in the Library of Congress. And those primary sources are priceless. You can't get what it was like unless you look at the primary sources.
Exactly.
The newspapers of the era were also, of course, very helpful, and you get the tone of the debate through those. But I think the letters and the diaries, unfortunately, are the main sources, because women have been pretty much written out of the history books. We know, like, this is a comment about Texas, and excuse me, Texas, but Texas just took Eleanor Roosevelt out of their textbook, and they put in Hillary Clinton as the token woman. Excuse me.
We can't have more than two powerful women in one book. Oh, no, 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 no.
So anyway, women need to be back in history books. They need to be in the science books. They need to be in every field. Women's history and women's contributions need to be clear.
And see here, writing women back into history. This comes from the National Women's History Alliance.
Good, good, good. There's a wonderful article in this month's Smithsonian about women scientists who've been written out of history. In every field, their contributions have been marginalized, mainly because men have had the power. And it's time. It's time for women to get not just the vote, but equality. And we're hoping that this is going to be the year when the Equal Rights Amendment gets finally ratified. Virginia is the best hope in that there's an active movement to try to introduce it again in their next legislative session. But it may have to wait until after the 2020 elections before it gets ratified. That was part of Alice Paul's legacy. In 1924, she introduced the Equal Rights Amendment, and New Mexico was one of the states that did ratify it in 1974, only 50 years later, when it finally went around to the states. So anyway, we're finally, I hope we're going to see that ratification. New Mexico's very good about having equal pay laws for women, but there are a lot of states that do not have equal pay, for instance. And you know, you can even see, like this summer, we had wonderful American soccer players complained that they were only getting half or what the male soccer players were playing, even though more women were being, the women's soccer games were being watched by more of the world. They played more games and so on. So we still need equal rights for women, equal pay. We need equal laws. We need equal access to reproductive birth control and things like that. And there are loads of other areas where women still do not have equality and opportunities in jobs and so on, that they're, you know, overlooked. And I think we need to keep on working on it. Democracy is a work in progress. And we're not going to give up.
Women, exactly right. And we are a work in progress. When I taught American history on the college level, I always said, please give me the second half from the Civil War to the present, because for me, American history is the expansion of the definition of citizenship. When we began as a country, it was white men who owned property. And then that concept of the franchise of who was a citizen, people said, we want more input. And so that began to grow. And we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which eliminated slavery, made African Americans and former slave citizens, and then theoretically granted them the right to vote. Of course, as we know, they had to wait 100 years until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 to actually have voting rights. But then we go on and we have the 19th Amendment, the Suffrage Amendment, that women worked 72 years to get the right to vote. And then we go on into the post-war, where we see many Native Americans who were finally enfranchised. So the expansion of what is a citizen, that is the story of American history. And all of these young women and young men who are going to participate in History Day, you are a citizen. You're going to grow up and be a citizen. So start studying now. It's a job.
Okay. And even those who are not citizens have the right and responsibility of participating in our democracy. We can only be as strong as the people's voice. We have to hold our leaders accountable. It's very, very important, whether or not you ever get the vote. We have a lot of people in New Mexico who are undocumented. Unfortunately, there are a lot of barriers and challenges to citizenship for a lot of people. And yet there are ways to contribute. And so part of it is study the issues, speak out on what's important to you. I'm very proud of the youth, by the way, speaking out on climate change. There are loads of things that youth can do. And, I think part of the whole message of this, suffrage centennial and also the breaking barriers is, getting that voice heard so that everyone is respected, youth and elders, citizen and non-citizen. We all have a place in our democracy. We all have the responsibility of participating and not giving up. I think there are a lot of people in the very tense rhetoric these days and divisive rhetoric who just want people to say, okay, forget it. Politics is not for me because it's too divisive.
It's too hard. It's too hard.
But actually,
our responsibility as citizens is to ensure that those who do not have the advantages that we have are protected. So those non-citizens, as a citizen, it is our responsibility to protect them.
Right, absolutely.
And I did want to say, just for people who are subscribing or considering subscribing to our YouTube channel, 2 weeks ago, we had a webcast about Native suffrage in New Mexico. And on September 17th, we had a Constitution Day special about sort of what you're talking about, Georgellen, but it's about increasing equitable access to education, to public education in America, which has been a women's rights issue and an immigrants' rights issue and a Native rights issue.
The Constitution, remember, is a living document, and it was designed as a framework to ensure that our citizens and non-citizens would be able to, as we say, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so if you are not working for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody, then you need to think a little more. So, and now I'll be quiet.
Well, I really appreciate your perspective. I think we're out of time today, unfortunately. I'm sure we could go on for another 2 hours.
And we could go on forever.
I hope we get that chance.
Can I make one more comment?
Oh, please.
Okay, August 26, 2020 is the actual Women's Equality Day. And one of the documents that I believe Ellen has put up on the website is what you can do in your community. Get your mayor to let you have a public park or your plaza or wherever, and have some suffrage centennial celebration for Women's Equality Day on August 26th, which is a Wednesday. Some people are trying to get that to be a national holiday. I don't know if that's going to happen, but anyway, celebrate Women's Equality Day, please. And there are loads of things that you can do at your schools, in your communities. You can have parades. You can have, let's see.
You can have speakers and music and all kinds of stuff, and
speakers and music and so on. But do know that in Albuquerque on Saturday, August 22nd at Civic Plaza, there's going to be a suffrage parade, and I think there's going to be ice cream. We have to talk to Mayor Keller. But anyway, there are going to be lots of things going on. And again, February 6th at the Capitol will be, there'll be proclamations and legislative memorials on the 19th Amendment and the League of Women Voters' 100th birthday. So I hope you can come to that. Ask your librarians, ask your museums to please give you some help so that you can find the materials. And let's not get this very important milestone in American democracy. Let's not let it pass without ample recognition. This is very, very important, with half of the population finally getting the vote.
yeah. And I'm going to say one more thing, even though I said I would shut up. And that is, I'm from Hobbs, and so I hope there's teachers from Hobbs and Roswell. I spent 10 years in Roswell watching, and I know things often don't trickle down to the southeastern part of the state. But next year, I want Hobbs and Roswell to celebrate Women's Equality Day. When I lived in Roswell, we used to celebrate Women's Equality Day, and we would march around with posters around the historical museum. Everybody thought we were crazy, but they came for the ice cream.
Wonderful.
Everybody will turn out for the ice cream, right?
That's right. That's my hook for Women's Equality Day. Have an ice cream social. Everybody will come.
Right. And we'll have balloons and so on. Yeah, have fun with this. This is a serious milestone, but it is also a fun milestone, and it's part of moving forward with our democracy.
And I guess I'll say my last bit, which is, even though Georgellen pointed out that we still have a long ways to go, I can say personally that reflecting on a century of progress for women's rights is a very joyous experience.
It really is.
Women have getting the vote really did impact us in so many positive ways, and all we have to do is look around at our state and see the leadership that we have at so many different levels.
Yes.
Who are, women who are empowered to take charge. So
we have 2 Hispanic governors in a row. And we are the first state to elect a Hispanic governor. So go for New Mexico. We're not last.
Yeah.
I think we have to give it to Governor Lujan Grisham also for appointing a lot of women to cabinet positions. She has recognized that women have not had opportunities to lead in the ways that we know they can. And I think, this is, she's been a leader there. And I'm encouraged that also I heard that the Commission on the Status of Women is going to get some funding. And we need to make sure that women's rights are always protected, because women's rights are everybody's rights.
Are human rights. Women's rights are human rights. And women are going to look around and say, we need to be sure that these people have the same rights. And I'm sorry, that's just not something men do.
Right.
Well, I think we'll leave it on that note.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And tune back in again 2 weeks. We're going to have we're going to have Alexandra McKinney from New Mexico State Historic Sites talking about breaking barriers in southern New Mexico.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen.
Boy, well, thank